Every evening, just before sunset, the lake turned to glass, and on the far side of that frozen mirror, an old gray wolf appeared, always in the same place, always watching. Have you ever seen a wild animal look at you, not with hunger, but with recognition? That's what Walter Harris, a retired fisherman from Montana, began to wonder after weeks of quiet encounters across the icy lake. He never planned to meet the wolf. He just came to fish to fill his bucket and forget the silence of an empty home. But nature had other plans. At first, it was just a glance across the water, yellow eyes meeting tired blue ones. The wolf never moved closer, never growled, never ran. It simply stood there, as if waiting for something. One evening, moved by a feeling he couldn't explain, Walter threw a fish across the frozen lake. It landed near the wolf's paws. The animal didn't flinch. It only lowered its head, took the fish gently, and disappeared into the dark pines. From that day on, it became their ritual. Every afternoon as the sun dropped lower, Walter would bring an extra fish. Every time the wolf would come, old, limping its fur, graying with frost. No words, no fear, no distance that really mattered. Just two old souls sharing what little warmth the world still offered. Beneath that pale Montana sky, man and beast were bound not by language, but by quiet understanding. But one cold winter evening, the wolf didn't appear. Walter waited. Minutes turned into hours. The lake remained still, empty like a broken mirror. What he discovered the next morning would change everything he thought he knew about compassion and about the wild itself. Before the wolf ever appeared, there was only the lake and Walter Harris. Walter had lived beside that water for nearly 20 years. His cabin was small, built by his own hands, back when his wife Anna was still alive. They used to call it the last quiet place, but after Anna passed away, the silence of the place grew heavier. The walls didn't echo with laughter anymore, only the slow creak of wood in the cold and the ticking of a clock that seemed to count down the rest of his days. He wasn't bitter, just alone. Fishing became less about the catch and more about routine, something steady to hold on to in a world that kept slipping away. Every morning he'd brew strong coffee, pack his tackle box, and walk the narrow trail down to the frozen shore. He never spoke aloud, but the forest knew his steps. Ravens would lift from the pines as he passed. The lake, in return, offered him quiet company, ripples of sunlight, whispers of ice cracking beneath the weight of time. Montana winters are not kind. Here the temperature can drop below 20 degrees. The air bites, the wind cuts, and even the sound of your breath feels frozen in midair. Yet life persists, elk herds crossing distant ridges. Eagles perched above the ice, and somewhere deep in the forest, wolves moving like shadows. Walter knew the stories. The locals whispered about a small pack roaming the area, 5 or 6 gray wolves that had once migrated from Yellowstone's northern range. He'd seen their tracks once or twice after a snowfall, always together. But lately, he'd noticed something different. The prints of one lone wolf separate from the others, older, slower, with one paw that dragged slightly. He didn't think much of it at first. Wolves came and went. That's the rhythm of the wild. But the day he first saw that wolf across the lake, standing still against the storm, something inside him stirred. There was a stillness in its posture, a dignity that reminded him of himself. Old, weathered, still standing. He started to wait for it without meaning to. Fishing became an excuse. He found himself checking the far bank every evening, watching for that gray figure to emerge between the trees. Sometimes the wolf arrived before sunset, sometimes after. Sometimes only its outline shimmered through the fog, faint, ghost-like, yet unmistakably real. As the days went by, Walter noticed its limp, the way it favored one leg, and how its ribs pressed sharply against its fur. He didn't feel fear anymore, only an ache. That's when he began to bring an extra fish. The forest seemed to take note of their ritual. Each day, the same rhythm repeated: man casts his line, wolf appears, fish arcs through the air. And though neither crossed the ice, the distance between them began to disappear in another way, quietly, invisibly. Walter started to speak aloud while fishing, as if the wolf could hear him. He'd talk about the weather, about Anna, about how time makes even memories fade, like footprints in snow. No answer ever came, but somehow he felt less alone. Winter deepened. The trees grew heavy with frost. The lake turned to steel, and still the wolf came thin, trembling, yet proud. One night, as the northern lights flickered faintly above the ridge, Walter thought he heard the faintest howl echo from the pines. It wasn't threatening. It sounded tired. He sat on his porch wrapped in an old blanket, staring into the dark where the sound had come from. A strange thought crossed his mind. Maybe he's not hunting anymore. Maybe he's just trying to feed someone else. He didn't know then how close he was to the truth. In the heart of that Montana winter, the old fisherman and the old wolf became two silhouettes mirrored on a frozen lake, both fighting the same quiet battle against loneliness and time. It happened on a morning colder than most. The air was so still that even the crows refused to fly. Frost clung to the window glass in thin white veins, and Walter woke to find the lake frozen solid from shore to shore. He brewed his coffee, layered his coat, and walked down the familiar path, boots crunching through snow that whispered like brittle glass. The silence felt heavier than usual. No wolf that morning. Not yet. He set his line, waited, watched his breath turn to clouds. The ice beneath him groaned softly, a sound that always reminded him how thin the world could be between life and the deep unknown. Hours passed. The sky turned pale gray, and just as he gathered his gear, a flicker of movement drew his eyes across the lake. There, near the tree line, the old wolf stood more fragile than ever. Its coat looked thinner, its breath labored, and one leg dragged behind it, leaving a crooked line in the snow. Something inside Walter broke. He didn't think. He simply reached into his bucket, took the fattest trout, and hurled it across the ice. The fish slid, bounced once, and came to rest just a few feet from the wolf. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the wolf limped closer, step by step, until its shadow stretched long across the white. It lowered its head, sniffed the fish, and instead of eating it, picked it up, turned around, and vanished back into the forest. That moment marked the beginning of something neither of them understood. The next morning, Walter brought 2 fish. The wolf came again, this time sooner, as if it had been waiting. And each day the pattern repeated. Walter arrived, cast his line, and saved the best catch for his silent visitor. Sometimes he'd wave. Sometimes he'd just nod, pretending the old creature could see him. There was no fear anymore, only quiet respect, the kind that grows between two beings who've both known loss. One evening, as snow began to fall thick and slow, Walter saw something new. The wolf didn't come alone. Behind it, faint in the twilight, smaller shapes moved, 2, maybe 3. Wolf pups. They hesitated at the forest edge, their eyes wide, their fur still downy against the wind. The old wolf turned toward them, dropped the fish he'd carried, and nudged them forward to eat. Walter froze. He understood. The old wolf wasn't feeding himself, he was feeding his young. That night, Walter sat by his cabin window long after dark. He couldn't shake the image, the way the wolf's ribs showed through his fur, the way he stood guard as the little ones ate. He remembered doing the same for Anna years ago, when she was sick, giving her the last of the food, the last warmth from the fire. And he realized that kindness, even in the wild, always costs something. The following morning, he didn't just bring extra fish, he brought every fish he caught. He spent hours in the cold, numb fingers, tying hooks, breathing mist into the wind, driven by a purpose that felt both foolish and holy. Days blurred into weeks. The lake became their meeting ground, man on one shore, wolf on the other, both aging under the same sky. Sometimes Walter would speak quietly across the frozen distance. He'd tell the wolf, "You're doing good, old boy. You're not alone out there." Of course, no answer came, but that didn't matter. There was understanding in the silence, a language older than words. Each evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, Walter would look across the lake and see the old wolf waiting, tired, steadfast, never asking, never taking more than what was freely given. And though they never crossed paths, he felt a strange certainty deep inside, that somehow, somewhere in that frozen forest, the wolf understood gratitude the same way Walter once understood love. By mid-January, the lake had turned into a world of glass and silence. The ice stretched unbroken to the horizon, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Montana winters don't forgive easily, not man, not beast. Walter Harris felt it in his bones. His fingers cracked from the cold. His breath came out in clouds that froze to his beard. But still he went down to the lake each morning, bucket in hand, heart expectant. Sometimes the wolf came early, sometimes not at all. When it did appear, its fur glistened with frost ribs, pressing through a coat that once must have been thick and proud. Its steps were slower now, but its eyes still burned with that same steady fire, an echo of survival itself. Each time Walter threw the fish across the ice, the wolf took it without hesitation, vanishing into the forest's pale breath. And though the distance never closed, Walter began to feel less like a giver and more like a messenger, passing life from one shore to another. Some days, the blizzards came so strong that Walter could hardly find the trail to the lake. He'd walk against the wind, head down, snow piling on his shoulders, until he reached the frozen edge where he always stood. And somehow, through the blur of white, he'd glimpse movement, the wolf standing where it always did, waiting. It didn't make sense. Any wildlife biologist would have said wolves avoid humans. They keep miles between their territory and ours. But this wasn't about logic anymore. It was about persistence. Two survivors keeping each other alive in ways neither could explain. Walter began to notice small changes. One morning, the wolf didn't carry the fish away. It stayed watching him longer than before. Its ears flicked at the sound of Walter's voice. "Go on," he said quietly. "Take it to them." The wolf blinked, then turned limping toward the forest once more. He didn't know why, but Walter started leaving a few fish in a pile at the same spot each day. He marked it with a stick, so he'd know if anything came for them. By the next dawn, the snow around the spot was covered with tiny prints. Wolf pups, maybe 2 or 3, judging by their size. He smiled to himself. "So you've been busy, old boy," he whispered. "But nature always tests what it gives." One evening, a storm swept down from the ridge without warning, the kind that erases everything. Wind howled like 1,000 voices. Snow swallowed the lake whole, and Walter lost sight of the opposite bank. He waited by the window lantern, glowing faintly behind frosted glass. Hours passed. No shadow moved beyond the swirling white. The next morning, he fought his way to the lake. The ice was blank, the world soundless until he saw it. A trail of paw prints leading halfway across, then stopping near a dark patch where the ice had cracked. His heart froze. No. But the wolf wasn't there. Just a tuft of gray fur caught on a branch, and a single fish lying untouched on the snow. Walter knelt down, his knees sinking into the frost. The fish had frozen solid, a small offering returned. He stayed there for a long time, listening to the silence, to the wind moving through the pines, to the ache that filled the empty air. That night, he couldn't sleep. The storm had passed, but its weight remained. He wondered if the old wolf had finally succumbed not to hunger, but to the relentless mercy of winter. Still, something inside him refused to accept it. He kept fishing, kept leaving food, kept watching the tree line for movement. Days turned into a week, then 2. And just when hope began to thin, he saw it again. Through the soft veil of snowfall, the wolf emerged. Thinner than before, its limp, worse but alive. It stood there, head lowered, breathing heavily, and for the first time it didn't take the fish. It just looked at him. That look stayed with him, raw, wordless gratitude. Then the wolf turned, vanishing into the forest shadows once again. Walter felt something break loose inside. Not pain, but a strange peace. He whispered, "Go feed them. You've done enough here." The bond between them had become something sacred, unspoken, forged through cold and hunger and patience. Each had given the other something they couldn't find elsewhere. Purpose. That night, Walter carved a small wooden figure of a wolf and placed it by the window. The next morning, fresh tracks appeared near his cabin door, light circling once before fading back into the woods. He smiled. Maybe the old wolf wasn't the only one watching now. That winter bound them together like threads of frost across glass, fragile, beautiful, inevitable. And as February came with the promise of thaw and loss, Walter didn't yet know that their story was nearing its final chapter. Because when kindness meets the edge of nature, something always has to give. The storm came without warning, a white wall rolling down from the mountains, swallowing the forest whole. Walter was in his cabin watching the lake vanish behind curtains of snow. He could hear the wind screaming through the chimney like the cry of something alive. By nightfall, the power went out. The fire sputtered and died, leaving only darkness and the sound of branches snapping under the weight of ice. He waited. Every hour he looked out the frosted window, searching for movement, for that familiar silhouette at the far bank. But the world outside had become a blizzard of ghosts. For 2 days he stayed inside, trapped by the storm. His food ran low, his breath misted in the cold air. The cabin walls groaned as if about to collapse. Still, he thought of the wolf, the old gray shadow limping through snow, fighting the same wind. On the 3rd day, the sky cleared. The world outside was unrecognizable. Snow lay chest-deep in places, the lake hidden beneath an ocean of white. Walter wrapped himself in every layer he owned, grabbed his walking stick, and stepped outside. Each step cracked through the crust of snow. The silence was so complete it pressed against his ears. He followed the familiar path down to the lake, or where it used to be. The ice was still there somewhere beneath, but covered now with drifts so deep he could barely tell where land ended and water began. He walked across anyway. The wind bit his face. His knees trembled. But something pulled him forward, that quiet bond forged over so many silent evenings. Halfway across, he saw it, a dark shape near the tree line. He thought for a moment it might just be a fallen log, until he saw the curve of fur dusted with frost, the shape of a muzzle pressed into snow. His chest tightened. He hurried, stumbling, falling to his knees beside the still form. It was the old wolf. Lying on its side, eyes closed, body curled as if trying to shelter something beneath it. Walter's gloved hand trembled as he brushed away the snow and froze. Underneath the wolf's chest, nestled in a hollow it had dug before dying, were bones of fish half eaten and tiny paw prints leading away into the trees. He understood then the wolf hadn't been waiting for food. It had been waiting for trust. He sat there for a long time, snow gathering on his shoulders, his eyes on the horizon where the pups had gone. And then something strange happened. From deep within the forest came a faint sound, not loud, not fierce, but clear. A howl, high, trembling, young. Then another, and another. Walter looked up. 3 small silhouettes appeared at the edge of the trees, watching him. They didn't come close, didn't run. They just stood there, the same way their father had once done, silent, still staring across the snow. He raised a hand just once and smiled. The pups tilted their heads as if recognizing the gesture. Then, one by one, they turned and disappeared into the forest. For the first time in years, Walter wept. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. A quiet awe at how the wild could mirror the human heart. He stayed until dusk, whispering words only the wind could carry. "Thank you, old boy. You did what you came to do." Then he covered the wolf with pine branches, a hunter's burial simple and true, and placed one of his carved fish beside it. As he stood to leave, the northern lights shimmered faintly above the ridge, painting the snow in green and gold. He took it as a sign that life in its own way always finds a way to pass the light forward. When Walter finally returned to his cabin, the night felt different. The silence that used to weigh on him now felt full, as if something unseen was keeping watch. He looked out over the frozen lake one last time, and though no shadow moved across the far bank, he could almost hear it, a soft echo in the wind, the voice of the wild, saying goodbye. When the storm cleared for good and spring crept slowly across Montana, the story of the old wolf didn't stay hidden for long. A wildlife officer found Walter one morning down by the lake repairing his small wooden dock. She'd seen footprints, human and wolf, during a regular patrol and came to ask questions. At first, Walter hesitated. He didn't want to explain something that words could never capture. But she was kind young, with eyes that reminded him of someone who still believed in wonder. So he told her about the wolf, the fish, the pups, about how two lives had crossed by chance and how somehow that had changed him. The officer listened in silence. Then she said softly, "You know it's illegal to feed wild predators, right? Even out here." Walter nodded. "I do now." He looked down at his hands, weathered and shaking. "I never meant to tame him. I just didn't want him to starve." The report made its way through the department, a harmless old man feeding a dying wolf. But social media had other plans. A local hiker who had filmed the wolf's tracks earlier that season posted Walter's story online. Within days, it spread the fisherman and the wolf of Mirror Lake. Thousands of comments poured in. Some called it a miracle of coexistence. Others called it interference. Biologists debated on radio shows. Activists argued in forums. Should humans ever intervene in the wild, even out of compassion? Where does kindness end and control begin? Walter didn't listen to any of it. He didn't own a phone, didn't care for noise. He just kept living the way he always had, quietly with respect. One afternoon, a team from a wildlife rescue center arrived. They'd tracked reports of wolf pups seen near the ridge, 3 healthy juveniles moving with what seemed like a new pack. The team wanted to tag and monitor them, ensure they could survive independently. They asked Walter if he'd seen anything. He just smiled faintly and said, "They're where they're supposed to be." The rescue workers left him with pamphlets and a warning next time to call professionals. But one of them, a woman with gray streaks in her hair, paused before leaving. "I read about you," she said. "What you did. It made people talk. Not about laws. About empathy." He nodded, unsure what to say. She smiled. "Sometimes that's enough." Weeks passed. The snow melted and the lake began to breathe again, dark water pushing through cracks in the ice. Walter spent most evenings sitting on his porch, carving small wooden wolves. He left them on the railing, one for each fish he'd thrown across the ice. Tourists began visiting the lake that summer. Some came hoping to see the wolf of Mirror Lake. They never did, but they often left something behind: a coin, a feather, a note saying thank you. The Wildlife Service eventually decided not to fine Walter. The official statement read, "While human interaction with predators is discouraged, the actions of Mr. Harris appear to have had no lasting negative impact on the local population." Unofficially, though, the story had already done something larger. It reminded people that compassion, when offered humbly, doesn't always weaken the wild. Sometimes it honors it. One night, months later, Walter heard a sound that froze him mid-step, a distant howl drifting across the valley. It wasn't deep like the old wolf's had been. It was higher, younger, stronger. He stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung low over the lake, the same pale silver that had once framed two lonely figures on opposite shores. The howl came again, and this time he answered not with sound but with a quiet smile and a tear that glistened like ice under moonlight. Walter's story became a gentle legend not about breaking rules, but about remembering why they exist, to keep the wild truly wild, and to remind us that even laws need a heart behind them. By early summer, the lake had changed again. The ice was gone, replaced by ripples of sunlight and the hum of insects dancing above the reeds. The world had thawed, and so had Walter. The cabin felt warmer now, filled with light that spilled through the windows. But even in that warmth, a quiet realization had begun to grow. His time there was ending. The place had given him healing. The wolf had given him meaning. And both had taught him that love in any form is not meant to be held forever. One evening, he sat by the lake again, fishing rod idle beside him. He wasn't here for fish anymore, just for the silence, for the memory of what once stood across the water. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and thawed earth. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called that long echoing sound that always felt half human, half ghost. Walter closed his eyes. He could almost see it, the old wolf on the opposite shore, standing tall as the sun melted behind the ridge. He could almost hear the crunch of snow, the soft breath, the unspoken promise that neither of them would forget. He had decided it was time to leave the cabin. The ranger had offered to help him move into a small town nearby, a quieter place, closer to people, closer to care. He'd resisted at first, but the truth was, simple life was asking him to pass the torch just like the old wolf had done. Before he left, he wanted to say goodbye properly. So he carved one last figure, not of the wolf, but of its pups. 3 small shapes huddled together, heads lifted as if singing to the sky. He set it on a stone near the water's edge, facing the forest. He spoke aloud, voice trembling but clear. "You taught me that love doesn't need to speak," he said. "It just needs to endure." The wind picked up, then a light breeze from the forest rippling the water's surface. It felt like a breath, like a response. For a long moment, he stood there, eyes on the horizon. The sun dipped lower, washing the world in gold. And then faintly, he heard it, distant but unmistakable. A howl. Not one of sorrow, but of life. The call of a young wolf echoing across the same lake where its father once stood. Walter smiled. He whispered, "You're home." He turned back to the cabin one last time. Inside, everything was simple. The bed neatly made, the coffee mug washed and drying, the carved wolves lined up on the windowsill like silent sentinels. He packed a few things, his coat, his tools, and Anna's photograph. Before leaving, he stopped by the window and looked out at the lake, the trees and the carving by the shore. He whispered, "Thank you for the company." Then he closed the door. As he walked up the trail, the evening light followed him, long shadows stretching ahead like paths into another life. And though he left the lake behind, he carried something with him that no one could see, a quiet understanding that everything we love eventually becomes part of the wild again. By the time Walter reached the ridge, the last light was fading. He looked back one final time and thought he saw movement near the lake's edge. a shadow small and swift, crossing the same path the old wolf once took. He smiled. Maybe some stories don't end. They just find a new voice to carry them forward. A week after Walter left the lake, spring finally bloomed across the valley. The snow melted into silver streams that trickled through the pines, carrying whispers of what the winter had buried. In town, life was easier, warmer rooms, neighbors who waved the steady rhythm of voices and footsteps. But sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, Walter's mind drifted back to the lake. He'd close his eyes and still feel the weight of the fishing rod in his hand, hear the wind whistling between the trees, see that old gray figure across the ice. The world around him had changed, yet something inside him still belonged to that frozen silence. One evening, restless, he decided to visit the lake again just once more. The drive was long and winding, the same dirt road he had taken for 20 years. By the time he arrived, the sun had begun to fall behind the mountains. Everything looked both familiar and new. The cabin stood quiet, half swallowed by wildflowers. The dock, though weathered, still reached into the calm water. The carved wooden wolves on the porch had aged beautifully, their surfaces darkened by rain, but their shapes still proud. Walter walked slowly toward the shore. His knees ached, his breath came short, but each step felt like a homecoming. There beside the lake, he saw what he had left months before the carving of the 3 pups. Only now, it wasn't alone. Beside it, scattered in the grass, were bones of fish, clean sun-bleached, and faint paw prints in the mud leading to and from the water. He knelt, heart trembling. A single gray hair clung to the carving's base, caught by the wind. He smiled. The forest was alive with evening sounds, crickets, wind, and somewhere far away, the distant call of a wolf. But this time, it wasn't a cry of loneliness. It was a chorus. 3 voices rising together, blending into the rhythm of the valley. Walter closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. It wasn't memory anymore. It was presence. He whispered, "You made it." The air shifted, carrying the faintest scent of pine and wet fir, the kind of smell that clings to life in the wild. He looked up toward the ridge where the sound had come from, and for just a heartbeat, he thought he saw them, 3 silhouettes standing under the fading sun. Then they were gone. But the feeling remained, something like peace, something like grace. He understood then. The wild doesn't owe us anything. It only mirrors what we give patience for patience, trust for trust, love for love. Walter stayed until the stars appeared. He lit a small lantern by the carving, the way he used to light candles for Anna. The flame flickered in the night wind, soft and golden, mirrored in the still lake. And then, for the first time in a long time, he spoke aloud, not to anyone, but to everything. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me that even in silence, we're never truly alone." He sat there until the moon rose big and silver, hanging low over the horizon. The night was perfectly still. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, one final howl rose. Not young, not old, something timeless. Walter smiled through tears. He whispered, "Good night, my friend." The wind carried his words away across the lake, through the trees into the wild that had once held them both. The next morning, hikers found the little lantern still burning beside the carved wolves. No one touched it. They said the lake felt different that day, calmer, as if something unseen was watching over it. And when the wind passed through the pines, it carried a sound that could have been anything, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of water. Or maybe, just maybe, the echo of a promise between an old man and a gray wolf still kept beneath the Montana sky. In the end, the story of Walter Harris and the old wolf by the lake wasn't about man and beast. It was about recognition, that quiet moment when 2 living souls separated by language still find a way to understand each other. The wild has always mirrored the human heart. We fear it because it's unpredictable, powerful, untamed. But if you look long enough, you'll see that same wildness in yourself, the part that loves without reason, that endures without reward. Walter's act of kindness didn't change the world. It changed his world, and that was enough. When we choose compassion, we don't tame nature. We remember that we are part of it. Every gift we give, every moment of mercy, ripples outward, even when no one is watching. Maybe that's the real legacy of the old wolf. Not the howl that faded into the pines, but the quiet proof that empathy survives even in the harshest winters. If you ever stand by a lake at dusk, and the world grows still, and the trees whisper with voices you can't quite name, listen closely. You might hear it too. A reminder that kindness never dies, it simply changes form. The wind, the water, the wolves, they all carry it forward. Walter's story reminds us that sometimes the smallest gestures, a shared glance, a single act of giving, can echo longer than a lifetime. If this story moved you, share it. Support the sanctuaries that protect these animals, and subscribe to help us keep telling the stories that prove the wild still has a heart, because every howl in the dark deserves to be heard. Somewhere in the forests of Montana, under the same sky that watched over Walter and the old wolf, a new generation runs free. Their songs carry through the valley not of sorrow, but of survival, not of endings, but of echoes.